I did put in the chat, by the way, up at the very top, a link to the LinkedIn article that sort of sparked this meeting topic by Gayatri Bhalla, who is with us today. Gayatri, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you all.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. Well, why don't we get started? Gayatri is the Senior Vice President for Digital Strategy at GMMB, which is a strategic communications firm based in DC that has worked with the Carter Center and the six democracy resilience networks, including the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust, for the past few months. Gayatri is an expert in digital and social media, has deep marketing strategy and advertising expertise um, and knows a little bit about politics too, which is why we invited her here today. She wrote a LinkedIn article a few days after the election, I think on the 14th, that I just found very compelling. And it talked about how um, the two sides have sort of, one side has begun to figure out the new media, and the other side seems to be maybe a little less so. I'm just quoting from the article and paraphrasing a bit here. Democrats, she wrote, have no winning strategy to engage low engagement voters. The approach they're taking with earned media and traditional media, that would be people who do what I used to do in print journalism, for example, means that the Democrats are continuing to reach only those voters who are paying attention. So the ones who are already leaning in. Gayatri, let me turn it over to you. Tell us what your thoughts are on all this, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions from our viewers. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Was there a question already? No. Okay. Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen. I'm trying to think about how to, oops, no, that's not the right way to do it. So I'm out of practice with Zoom, but I can,
There should be a green sharing button at the bottom of your screen. If you roll your cursor down there, it ought to pop up.
yes, I think, there we are, share. Okay. Do you
There
guys
we
see?
go.
All
Yep.
right, I'm going to keep this in. I'm not going to go into presentation mode, mostly because then I'm not so good at presentation mode, and I don't know what builds there are in here. Thank you so much, David and team. It's a pleasure to join you. I've had a chance to talk with Lacey and Nikki and others who've been supporting your organization. Uh, so a little bit what I thought what I did today is I pulled together some thoughts based on the piece that I wrote, but I added a lot more. And I thought something that might be helpful for kind of frame our time today. I've asked Lacey to grab questions in the chat. I'm happy to stop at any point and take them. I have a hard time seeing people. So Lacey, I'm gonna have you kind of MC and help us out there a little.
No
Um,
problem.
I put together some thoughts on the shifting landscape that voters that we are all in, how the media environment has changed, as David said. I've got some observations on how social media, how new media, how television, how earned media is changing. So I brought some charts and some data to share with you. I thought I would touch on two particular parts of new media that might be something that's definitely something that had a big impact in the 2024 cycle. It's not the first time we're seeing it. It is, however, there are some endemic trends that show that this is going to grow even more, and those are in the areas of podcasts and gaming. And then I thought I'd take a step back and just kind of look at media consumption trends, this time with a lens around devices, because I think it's helpful to understand the means, the method that which folks are interacting with all this new media. And then I'll close with some thoughts around content in terms of what are the impacts for the content that this organization might think about in terms of this new media landscape and what to focus on moving forward. A little bit of background on myself. So David has explained a little bit about what I do here. So I look after the digital strategy team here at GMMB. And that for us, we have a whole team that's dedicated towards paid media. I have a deep background in paid media. It's not what I do here. It is really helpful, though. What I do here is around the owned and earned digital presence. So this typically means helping our clients think about how do they bring themselves to life? How do they represent themselves in a virtual world through things like their website, their email programs, their YouTube content, their social media content, their partnerships with online personalities, be that podcasters or influencers, that type of thing. Everything that's about things that you earn, that you own, not things that you buy from an advertising perspective. So that's what I do here, and that's what I've done for a long time. My background, however, comes from I'm a bit of a nerd. I have a very deep background in big data. I love data. You're going to see a lot of charts and graphs here. I particularly love modeled data and have a lot of points of view on data sets and how one can use advanced learning to get more out of the data. I also have done this work in the television buying space. So I mentioned that I have a deep paid media background. I actually got to work on the first time that a major campaign, which was back in the 2012 cycle, to buy television in a different way. So to try and reach voters in New Jersey's third district who are left-handed and care about these issues, and how instead of buying just the television, the evening news, you could also find those same voters watching game show TVs at midnight. So being able to apply data into a very non-data media space. And I did that in the commercial side as well. I also have a specialty, for better or worse, in the scary world of being able to bridge online and offline data. So this is why when you start looking for red shoes at Christmas, you start being haunted by the ads of red shoes. That underlying technology is something I spent a fair amount of my career building, so I understand it, and I've learned a lot from that. And then working with actual data, people in the real world, voter files. I used to run one of the voter files in the political space, which compiles lists of data voters from secretaries of state boards of election, DMVs, et cetera. So we did that nationally at the country. And then I've done campaigns at the political level as well as in the commercial space. And I started my career actually regulating the space, working on Capitol Hill, doing what is still, in fact, the only legislative piece we have on the books, which is the 1996 Cable Act, and that governs access to online to internet providers. We still don't have legislation that's more recent than that, which is a problem. But I have a weird background, but that really informs a lot of the perspectives that I'll share with you today. So with that, I thought I would cover some big fundamental shifts in the space. So the biggest fundamental shift, which is the basis of the art of my point of view and what I wrote, is that the American public consumes media differently today. Today, consumers spend about 8 hours of their day on digital media alone. This is roughly double the amount of time on traditional compared to traditional formats. So does that mean that people are not reading newspapers? No, but readership is down. Does that mean that people are not watching TV? No, it means what they're consuming on their television set isn't traditional TV anywhere as much anymore. So what might that look like? As an example, most people, so televisions are still the largest screen in the house. There are more TVs than any other device in the home. And it's very much a lean back environment. You have the big screen, you'll lean back, you'll watch a show. Today, that also means you are double or sometimes triple or quadruple streaming, where viewers of the television show also have their phone, likely also have a tablet. Of everyone in the room watching the show, they're also watching other devices. So you may have anywhere from 6 to 12 devices in one room at one time, all consuming different content. And even on that big screen, it isn't always a television show. It is very often YouTube, actually, where people are accessing the app YouTube and then choosing the videos they want to see. And there's a lot of fragmentation on the data collection side of media trends today, which means that, and we've gotten pretty good at it, I'll share some data later, but where people are understanding what is being consumed on the big screen. But the big takeaway here is that everything that I've just described that is a very different media environment than it was even 4 years ago. A little bit of data, we actually hit the tipping point in the overturn back in 2017, where to, is there a question? Okay.
So
Um,
just ask everyone to mute their mic if they're not speaking. Thank you.
Back in 2017, that's when we saw digital time spent on per day on digital media overtake time spent per day on traditional media. And this data was put together by eMarketer. We are here in 2024, and at the time this was modeled, this is in fact turned out to be true. And we see that divide, we get that divide growing even more. You see the spike here with the pandemic, but we have now surpassed pandemic levels of time consumed in digital media. So this is not a trend that's shifting. It was not going back. Let's down click a little bit different more into how the American public consumes that media differently today. So this is a study, this is an amalgamation of different data sources specifically focused on swing voters in 2024. And one of the things that we found is that swing voters in 2024, they consumed news about the election from social media, not from traditional news outlets. And it's just, that means that they're getting their news first from YouTube, from X, from Facebook, and depending on the demographic, the generation, from TikTok. So this is a massive, some of this is news outlets posting their content in social media. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. It's actually not coming from news outlets. So this is coming from social first information sources, not news outlets posting on their social channels. And this is a trend that it's pretty remarkable, and it causes us to take pause and say, if news is not being consumed as much and through the traditional channels that it's normally be consumed, how do we get news out to consumers? Because it's not that they're not necessarily low information, they are different information voters than they were before. So digging down a little bit deeper, and this chart is a bit of there's a lot of data on here, so I'm just going to spend a moment on it. On the far left, you have all of the different social outlets listed. On the next column is looking at age, so adults that are monthly users of those social outlets. So we see that YouTube is the largest number of consumers of in terms of all of the social apps. We do consider YouTube a social app because of the commenting feature on it. There are conversations, comments, likes, interaction that makes it like a social platform. YouTube is YouTube is notable for being incredibly different than every other destination and media source today because it is YouTube TV. It is also the second largest search engine on the globe, and it is a social media juggernaut. So it is all the things, which is a really interesting phenomenon, and accounts for why more people use YouTube than any other social platform. The next column is really interesting. Where do people regularly get their news? From YouTube, more than every other social media outlet, more than any other platform. Also, the amount of time spent on YouTube is higher. And the next column is the percent of daily use of swing voters. So this is shining a lens on those voters who were undecided, those who could swing one way or the other across parties. This shows the percentage of those voters by platform, the amount of time that they spent they're not the amount of time, the daily use of the platform, because just having a lot of users is not what we pay attention to in our world. We pay attention to active users on a daily basis. That tells us something more about it. As an example, a lot of folks went out after the election and joined Blue Sky. That's wonderful. It's great. Are people using it daily? That's something that we're keeping a close eye on. And then the last column here is I wanted to call out, it's a flag of whether or not that social outlet accepts political advertising. Most And I would posit that in the 2024 election, one of the big differences between the parties is both parties spent more money than God on this election. There was no shortage of money. No candidate had a shortage of money, and there was no shortage of ad spend this cycle. What is notable is that when you look at all of this, if you take the premise that social media is where people are spending the preponderance of their time, not you cannot buy time on half of the social media outlets. And if that's where people are getting their news, it means that you can't having an ad means that if they're spending more time there and there's no ads shown on that outlet, no political ads at least are allowed. Sometimes they allow ads, but not political ads. TikTok's an example of that. That means that your message is not going to go in front of those voters unless you have an organic or earned presence on those outlets. So we're going to end with content. I'll come back to this important point in a little bit. All right, the next fundamental shift in 2024 that we saw is not just where people are getting their news, but who they're getting it from. So this is a study done in November of 2024, looking at a survey of adults in the last couple of weeks of the election, saying, where did you get your election news by age group? 83% of voters ages 44 and younger get their news not from news outlets. They're not from local or national news. So the traditional sources of news are not the traditional distributors of news. Let's dig down a little bit more into that. Here's an example of looking at WhatsApp. I think that this group uses WhatsApp to communicate. For those of you who are not familiar with it, WhatsApp is owned by Meta, who owns Facebook and Instagram and Threads. And it's a one-to-many sort of messaging platform, short messaging and multimedia messaging platform. It's secure. And we see a lot of usage in WhatsApp particularly amongst certain demographic groups. Amongst Hispanic and Latino community, 56% of that community uses WhatsApp on a daily basis. Asian community is also very high users. This is how I'm from India. This is how I stay in touch with my family in India. I'm on it every day. WhatsApp also this year debuted a way for organizations to communicate called channels. And WhatsApp channels is something that we started to see an uptick on. But when people spend this much amount of time of their digital time every day on this particular channel, and this is also where they're getting their news. They're getting their election news from these types of channels, which are peers and friends, not organizations, unless they happen to subscribe to a WhatsApp channel. So this is growing. And the other sort of big macro trend that we see in the social media space is that we see growth not just in sort of posting and daily usage, but the largest spike in growth is in one-to-one message, small group messaging in social media. And this is part of that trend of people getting their news from smaller localized groups rather than from organizations. And that's just sort of a generalized shift, not just specific to politics. All right. So if people spend time in more different places than ever before, and where they're getting their news is also fundamentally different, the implication then is that for reaching voters today, one must have different messengers to reach voters today. The traditional messenger of the news environment is so fragmented, not just amongst channels, and outlets, but people are not tuning into the news. So trust in media, trust in organizations and institutions is at an all-time low. It's never been lower than it is now. Americans increasingly
Trump.
It's going to be interesting to see how this works. I think that the trend has been moving in that direction, not just because of the president-elect, but I think that institutions in general are dealing with a crisis of trust and brand trust. We see this on the commercial side of the business as well. And going back to the news outlets, Americans increasingly, so we just talked about how they're getting their news from non-news sources, and from a channel perspective, they're getting their news more from social media than from any other channel. Particularly amongst younger voters, they're getting this news from TikTok, and it's going to be interesting to see how the recent court decision shakes out. It's definitely going to have an impact, and something that we're keeping a close eye on. And then millennials in particular, and Gen Z and Gen Alpha even more so, trust peers in the form of influencers more than they trust brands or the media.
Gayatri, we have a couple questions in the chat,
Yeah.
kind of in this vein. The first one is from Bill, and he asks, "How does traditional media survey in the future?" Is that something that you will get to in there, or would you like to answer that now?
Can I just get a clarification, Bill? When you say survey, do you mean polling, or what do you,
Survive. Sorry, survive.
oh, how do they survive?
Okay, that's just got it. I think he meant survive, but yeah, we got survey too. But survive. Will traditional media survive in the future?
I think it will. I think it's going to look really, really different than it does today. There are, and I think we're trying to see we're looking and we're seeing this play out in real time. So, for example, we saw this trend that subscription in newspapers was going down. A couple of slides. I'm going to show how the trend in other subscription types, particularly podcasts, are going up. So people are getting their news not from traditional news outlets such as the New York Times, but they're now getting the New York Times podcast, and they're getting their news from that outlet. So I'm not sure how they're going to survive by changing their business, by being in different places, by creating content in different formats, and I think also by thinking about how news is disseminated in a more just throughout a diaspora, throughout a portfolio of different ways of getting the same story out. So as an example, they'll still do the long form article posting, but there will be a corresponding YouTube series of videos that does a deeper dive. There will be snippets of that. They currently already do that. We'll post snippets of it on Threads, on X. There will be talking heads recording a podcast, then recording a YouTube video, then taking those snippets and putting them as YouTube shorts. And on TikTok, there'll be a longer form piece on LinkedIn. So it's going to be the same news. It's going to be cut up and distributed in very different ways. And the news organizations that are most successful at figuring out how to approach content from a much more diverse perspective, they're going to be the ones that last longer.
And we've got another question. Does WhatsApp moderate posts in English? I always thought WhatsApp was a direct messaging service. That was from Chris O'Brien.
WhatsApp is private, it's within a group, and so it does not monitor, it doesn't moderate. WhatsApp channels does offer moderation. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure if that gets at what you were focused on.
Yes, I wasn't. I didn't even. I never heard about the WhatsApp channels before you mentioned it today. Thank you.
Yeah, we can, Lacey, I know we have a one page, we can send that to the group, that sort of talks about how folks are using it today. Some of our clients, particularly state health departments, are using WhatsApp channels to distribute information to communities for health issues.
All right, and I've got two more for you. One is from Kristen, but the lack of trust is based on conspiracy theories and lies. So what are we supposed to do with that?
So lack of trust is, it's based on actually lots of things. I did not bring that data today. I will make sure you send these, I'll send you the slides. I've sourced everything in here with links so you can read the longer form article in the studies. It is not just based on misinformation. It's that and this is actually the point of this particular piece of the presentation. It's not just, it's that people don't have faith in they have to trust that the messenger that's giving them the story. And so the reason that we see this increase in podcasters and trust in podcasters going up is that podcasters have been out there with their point of view and a whole arc and stream of messaging for a long time. And they have built up long form, back and forth, debated content on their point of view, and you might not necessarily agree with it, but their viewership respects the perspective, and the respects the ability, the fact that they're defending their perspective and that it's growing and migrating over time. It's more of a relationship. And this is a little bit at odds, I think, with this sense of people being low information voters. So on the one hand, people are not consuming as much news content, and the news content they are consuming is not coming from traditional news outlets. On the other hand, you also have this rise in people saying, I don't want to, it's overwhelming. I don't trust this. And they're getting the news from other places. But the trust is shifted, and it's more diverse in terms of the content that they're consuming. So podcasters aren't just about news. They're about all kinds of different topics. The biggest podcaster that we all heard about this cycle was Joe Rogan, who, for folks who are maybe has much gray hair as I do, will remember him from Fear Factor and not being a podcaster and not being particularly an opinionated, sort of talking head. He is someone who's built up a following over time and has had media organizations such as XM Radio and Sirius invest in his content and his distribution channels such that he is now incredibly established and has larger reach than almost any cable news program. It is insane, the reach that he has. And he has earned that over time by showing up, by receiving guests, by debating the issues. And he doesn't talk about the same thing always. It's a really wide variety of topics. The content he is putting out is incredibly diverse. It's not just about one topic. And the content that the American public is consuming is also incredibly diverse. They're consuming more content than ever, but lots of different kinds. So it isn't just one thing all the time. And that's part of what I think has made him so successful. And it's part of what I think has made this whole class of podcasters so successful.
Your next question was from Lori. Was this trend toward other media accelerated during COVID when candidates struggled to make contact and tried everything, now into focus of 2024?
The trend going back to this chart, we had already started to see the time on digital media creep up before the pandemic. So well before 2020. And 2017 is when we saw the tipping point. I think it's less about candidates, and this isn't just political, this is overall time spent. So let me handle that two ways. One is, overall, there is much more content, and we are spending more time on our devices consuming this content. So that's what contributes to the digital line overtaking the traditional line. For political candidates, the content it's less, they're all putting out a ton of content. I think my critique of this cycle is that just putting content out isn't enough. You have to put out content that engages people. So, and that also doesn't mean just putting like having a Facebook feed that's full every minute where you're posting every hour on the hour, or that your YouTube channel is constantly full. You're gonna put a lot of content out there. But if all you're doing is pushing content out with a megaphone and not actually engaging, social media is it's a cocktail party, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue. It isn't a monologue. The whole idea behind it is that you are entertaining questions, that you're putting something out there, letting people respond to it, engage with them in those reactions. That is why podcasters work so well. It's an engaging news format. There is a back and forth that traditional news outlets, that traditional TV outlets lack. There isn't that back or forth. And that is what the public has shifted towards, is that engaging. They are part of the story. They aren't just the consumers of the story. Does that answer the question, Lori? Or address the top?
Yes, thank you.
It also, there's someone that jumped on it that I think is in the same vein. There are other questions I'm going to save till the end because I think you're going to get there. But this one, in the statistics you're discussing right now, how is mis and disinformation defined? And that came from Steve.
Sure. So mis and disinformation, I'm going to go back because I mentioned it specifically here on WhatsApp. I could go on for a whole separate hour on mis and disinformation. All right. So mis and disinformation is behind a lot of, it touches upon this topic in a lot of different ways. One is because there's so many different content creators out there, and because people don't trust institutions, and people will trust whoever they've built a relationship or have some affinity with, which can be any number of legitimate and sometimes illegitimate accounts because you can be anyone on the internet. And people don't always know that, right? We've seen an increase in mis and disinformation in the 2024 cycle from foreign actors. So very much nefarious intent if a foreign actor is engaging in American public discourse. We see a rise in that, and because when you lose an arbiter of truth, which used to be our traditional news outlets, you end up with more of this growing. We are in the messy middle of this, and at some point it's going to have to swing back, and all of the social media platforms are grappling, and regulators are grappling with this issue of how do we clean things up? How do we get some sense of legitimacy? How do we balance that with free speech? We see this playing out in real time with Elon Musk and X. The study that was released this week by the Washington Post has shown how, again, it's one story, it's one study, but X is being charged with having dampened democratic or progressive content and allowed more conservative content in the weeks after Musk's endorsement of Trump for president. This is also a platform that Musk bought to champion First Amendment rights and to make things more to allow people to vote, to have it be a town square in theory. It's an imperfect place and it's an imperfect experiment at best. We're seeing this play out. It's going to be a mess before it gets cleaned up. How much of that is contributing to lack in trust? I think a fair amount, but I think people are choosing to go with those groups whom they have an affinity with, who they see a connection to. We saw that happening before the mis and disinformation. I think the other thing that I wanted to know on WhatsApp, so I mentioned that this larger trend of social media messaging flowing more to one-on-one as opposed to one-to-many, these smaller groups. WhatsApp is exactly an example of that. This is where there's been studies where we are seeing the spread of mis and disinformation faster in WhatsApp in smaller groups. And that needs to be studied more. These are private networks, so it's harder to study, but it is something that has been noted. So it's something that we all have to dig into and lean into. Okay. I'm going to go back to the slides. One of the points that I wanted to make here about reaching voters today requires different messengers. We saw in 2024 that this was very much the influencer election. The Democratic National Convention had influencers on the main stage. They had invited a whole pot of influencers. On the Republican side of the aisle, there was a whole army of thought leaders and influencers who were really popular, who were very involved in the campaign this cycle. Outreach strategies today require partnerships with influencers and content creators in order to get the word out. It isn't enough just to put stuff on your own channels. You've got to engage with others who have built out this incredibly loyal following and growing following. And it's just a necessary part of getting word out these days. And it's due, in fact, to these trends. Did you have a question, Jonathan? Okay. All right. So another trend, another fundamental shift. Information is no longer centrally disseminated. So we talked about how news outlets are dying in terms of how many people are getting their regular information from them. They are getting news from non-news sources. Search is another source of news. We've seen social media is a source of news, so non-news outlets on social media, and we see podcasts growing as a trend. So this is data from Pew Research from this year, from September, where we see for each year the percentage of news consumption by U.S. adults who get their news from these particular outlets. And so we see the trend growing in podcasts. We see the trend growing in social media. We see the trend, it's sort of even in search, and we see it dying down a little bit in news and web and news websites or apps. This data, I will say from a channel perspective, it gets messy, as I mentioned earlier, because news can be from a news outlet, from the website, from their social channels, from their own podcast. So we try and tease that apart as much as possible. But the big thing that I want you to take away from this data is this requires that everything, everywhere, all at once approach. When news is no longer centrally disseminated, it means that news content and information in general has to be distributed not just on your website, not just on your publication vehicle, but also it has to be visible from a search perspective. So this is where search engine optimization or SEO comes into play. But it also has to be pushed out and shared broadly in social media and in podcasts for it to have the reach that it used to have on its own. So it's not enough just to publish. You have to publish multiple times and in multiple formats. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on time. All right, fundamental shift number 5. The platforms where voters are getting their news do not accept political ads. So I mentioned this a little bit on a prior chart. What this means is that where people are predominantly getting their news, you cannot intercept with an advertising. It means that you have to be engaged on those social platforms where people are consuming news in an organic way in order to have your message discovered. So more than ever before, what in the agency side of the world, we help clients with both their organic presence and then their paid presence. It's never been more important that these two play hand in glove together, that integrated efforts are paramount for having the same reach that we used to have before. Because it's just, there are whole pockets, particularly for content that is political in nature, where platforms will not allow that content to play. So I'll give you an example. TikTok does not allow political. I know TikTok is up for, we're figuring out what's going to happen with it, but it's massive in terms of reach. They don't allow ads from political candidates or causes, but there's a ton of political content on TikTok, and there's a ton of reach on TikTok for political and for news. So it means that it's not just you having your own TikTok channel. It means working with other folks on TikTok, or allies, ambassadors, content creators, to help spread the word on their own channels on all of these other platforms. All right. I'm going to pivot to talking a little bit about some of the newer platforms that are emerging in terms of usage and sort of take rate and engagement rate, podcasts and gaming. So just a few slides. The podcasting audience has grown enormously since 2020, just to give you some sense of it. So in 4 years, the number of weekly listeners is up 50%. The total time listening has doubled. And the amount of folks who are advertising on podcasts, because it's just become the place to be, is up 200%. And we look at the ad spend because that tells us where people are realizing, because dollars follow audiences. And so when you see this percentage of growth, it says a lot about where both the consumer world and the news world and the political world are moving in terms of this is where the audience is. Podcasting is similarly messy from a data and reporting standpoint. Just something to know when you look at podcast data. Podcasts are distributed both from the podcasting platform, if that's Spotify or iHeart or Apple Podcasts, but they're also distributed through YouTube, through LinkedIn, through TikTok, where podcasts are recorded or filmed, and then that information is broadcast. So it's very hard to get discrete it's hard to get clean data. It's very much an emerging new media environment and ecosystem. I just mentioned that because podcast data is sort of all over the map. This is actually compiled from 2 different sources to make sure that we were deduping as much as possible. The other trend on podcasts is that the audience skews younger, but it's across the listener penetration by group. You can see here the percentage of folks that if you're over 65, they're only about 22% of that population will tune into podcasts, and it definitely skews younger. But the number of women, 32% of women weekly are tuned into podcasts. 48% of African Americans are, 43% of Latinos are. So we see that while it skews younger, it is a diverse and reflective of the American population in terms of who's engaging and regularly tuning into podcast content. Let me talk a little bit about gaming. Anyone who is not talking about gaming is ignoring Generation Z and younger. These numbers are even more skewed when you take into account the next generation, which is Generation Alpha. All right, so more young people play video games than do anything else in their media diets on a daily basis. I have 4 children. I have a 16-year-old son. Let me tell you, I feel this viscerally every day. Playing video games is what this population is doing. It is not just young boys, women, moms, people are gaming. This is a growing segment. It is the top segment for Gen Z. It's even higher for Gen Alpha, which will vote for the first time in 2028. And it's what they do more than they watch TV, more than they're on social, more than they're on the internet, like 2x more. So it's definitely something to pay attention to. Gamers spend more than 8 hours a week playing games. It's pretty evenly split gender-wise. 55% identify as male, 45% identify as female. And most US adults, 64%, play video games frequently. Military and veterans, as a group, also between 51 to 59% are playing video games frequently. This is a highly educated group. 52% have a college education. They are very savvy and very influential. So paying attention to the gaming world is important. I did not include data on what those platforms are, but I will speak to them. So gamers are super active on sort of native gaming social platforms. Those include platforms such as Twitch, TikTok, Discord, and Reddit predominantly. People will film themselves playing games. It's a lot like a podcast. There are people who are playing games. They will live stream them playing a game with another person virtually. They talk back and forth all the time about different topics. One of the candidates who I spoke about, who I wrote about, is Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York. She famously games. She doesn't just play World of Warcraft or Halo. She's also playing Animal Farm and Fortnite, and she will build games and build worlds, and she very much approaches gaming as a core part of her outreach strategy to her constituents. It's easy for someone who is of that generation. It's really hard if you are maybe you look more like me and you have more gray hair and gaming doesn't necessarily come naturally to you. Or maybe you play a game like me, like Pokemon or something, where it's not really something that I'm tuning in to watch other people play. I'm more old school, I guess. But gaming as an audience in order to be able to reach this younger demographic, given how much time they spend on it, it's something that has to be part of the portfolio. So what does that mean, for example, for a DRN? Like, are you going to be out there gaming and streaming your video? Probably not. But this is an example where your partnership strategy with content creators, with influencers, and outreach to those audiences that have built loyal followings with the segment of the electorate and the segment of the population and a growing segment of the population. This is where making sure that you've got a diverse portfolio of content partners talking about the issues that make sense so that you are getting the reach that you need to, because they're not tuning in. This is not a demographic that you're going to reach through another platform. They're not going to be spending time on Facebook and finding your content there. So you have to go to where people are. All right, media consumption. I'm looking at time. Do we end in 13 minutes?
Yeah. I would say I've got a handful of questions for you. If we can take like 5 to 10 minutes at the end.
Let me close with this, and I will send you the media consumption because it's more similar to what I've been talking about before. Here's the big thing on media consumption I want to say is the hours per day. I just want to talk about this. So the number of hours per day that your television or connected TV set is on, but look at mobile. It's a fast follow at 90%. People are watching TV, they're gaming, they're spending time. Mobile devices are huge on that. And we see this is not surprising to anyone that print has fallen off. The thing that might be surprising to folks, though, is that desktop reach is nowhere is much lower. It's the biggest screen and the smallest screen where people spend the most time. All right, and I will close, and I would also love to take more questions. All right, so of all of this, so of all of the media trends in terms of the analogy that I like to use, I'm a hockey fan. Wayne Gretzky famously talked about skating to where the puck was going to be. If in today's environment, for reaching folks, regardless of whatever topic that you're trying to reach them on, hopefully this is giving you some food for thought for where the puck is going to be in terms of trends for where people spend time online. It looks very different today than it even did in 2020, so just 4 years ago. The implications this has for the content that you put out there in order to make sure that your message is being consumed by the folks that who you want to reach means you have to think about things as stories and story arcs. It is much more storytelling. It is not sort of let me just put a point of view out there. You have to make it engaging such that the audience can see themselves and realize their part in that story. It is that everything everywhere all at once. So means making content in pieces because attention spans are also shortened. So you want to think about series of conversations, series of content. And then also the diversifying the content. So we talked about the New York Times having the long form content, the video, on YouTube, the short form video on TikTok, the longer article with maybe stats on LinkedIn, and doing visualizations that they'll share somewhere else. Like you have to chunk it up into a lot of different ways. So it's the same piece of content, but it's a slightly different lens and a different execution. Co-creation is your friend. You don't have to do this all alone. This is where working with partners, content creators, influencers helps you to get your message out because the messenger matters. And if the folks who you're trying to reach are not necessarily tuned into you, it means you have to go to where they are tuned in. And then finally, it is this always, always on phenomena, and it is a full-time job. I'll pause.
All right, well, I've got a handful of questions that I think will fit right in here. One is, how does private ownership or candidate ownership of these platforms, the social platforms, impact them? Like, for example, X or Truth Social?
I think we're seeing that. I think we're going to see that play out. I mentioned earlier that I worked on the first regulation and actually still the only regulation of the internet, which is the 1996 Cable Act, which tells you something about how old and out of date it is. We don't have regulation in this space. I think everyone is grappling with the fact that when you don't have you don't have the sort of the arbiter of media and traditional news outlets. We are the world is, and we have rules governing broadcast access. So there are laws in the book that govern what a television station has to have equal time, has to have certain amount, have to meet certain criteria. When in a media environment where people don't consume that time, don't consume broadcast, and are instead consuming the internet, which is a different spectrum of broadband, but still and those are unregulated, where we end up with the space that we are in now, and you have private ownership. And that was not contemplated. It is not contemplated by our current laws in the books. And our system of keeping up with it is it's woefully behind. We don't have a sense for how this is going to work out. And I do not think in this administration that more regulation is likely to happen. So I don't know. It's gonna be messy. We're in that messy middle.
And then this one actually is referring a little bit to earlier on, but wanted to wait here till the end. So how do traditional news outlets work with these other platforms? What specifically can they do?
So I think goes back to the content and being in different formats. So the example that we've been using today has been the New York Times will do a long form reporting piece on anything, on any story. They will put it together in the traditional outlet, the traditional article format. They will visualize the storytelling. In fact, the New York Times, I think, has the best data visualization folks I've seen, where they will take data and put it into streams, into series, and they will make something come to life, for whether that is an electoral map and the various scenarios in which that could play out, or if that is lead in the drinking water in Flint, Michigan, and how that's growing and spreading, or how that's not. They have done amazing reporting, and that's an example of content creation that is keeping up with the time and the pace of where consumers today are expecting it. So they will film, they will record the author talking about the article for a podcast. They'll turn that into a Q&A and they'll put that on a podcast, and they might film that and then put that on the YouTube channel. And they might chunk that into smaller chapters of content and create those as short form video, as YouTube shorts, and then on TikTok. So it's this very diverse portfolio of media distribution of the same piece of content.
And this next question is actually something you and I have been talking about often. Brian wants to know, it seems like gaming content creators would not want to get involved in politics as it would tend to alienate part of their audience. I think this can be true for lots of content creators in different areas, for example, music.
It is a great observation, and that is true. The way we think about content creators is they are individual business owners that have built a loyal following, right? They're like any other brand. And not all of them will be willing to engage. Some of them are. We saw this cycle that more people were willing to than ever before. That's become very common. Anyone out there, like if for content create like I'll take Joe Rogan. He is a huge influencer and a massive content creator, and he will welcome anyone onto his show. And that there's an example of someone who's built his brand on being, opinionated, sometimes combative. And he's a willingness to engage. And that I think is most important, is a willingness to engage. And some content creators are willing to, and some aren't. And you're going to have to tailor your mix of partners accordingly. I will say that when we approach working with content creators, we very much do so with there is always a great respect for the business that they have built, and there's a respect when we interact with them for what we are asking them to do. So a content creator will choose to work with us or one of our clients because they know that they're going to have we engage with them in a dialogue where we are tapping into their expertise, their subject matter knowledge, and their content creation expertise for how best to talk about this issue. So content creators are not other mouthpieces for you. They are partners for you in recasting and reframing and extending the message that you want to disseminate into their own words. And they have built an incredibly successful business. That's why you're talking to them in terms of they're following and connecting with their audience. And they're huge partners for helping to make sure that your message is as relevant as possible to the audience that you're trying to reach. So they're very much collaborators. They're not distributors. And then finally, the part about sensitivity. Yes, we are that is part of why we compensate content creators. They are taking a risk depending on the topic, and they'll be smart about it. Their business, they built their business. They were very savvy and smart in being able to do that. That's why we compensate them. We compensate them very fairly for engaging and for their content, for their expertise in the creation of the material that they're doing for us.
And just seeing some questions in the chat. Yes, we will be sharing this PowerPoint with Scott and David to pass along to everyone. I believe this is also being recorded. I'm not sure if David and Scott are planning on sharing that. David,
Yes, that'll be on YouTube.
Yep, beautiful. We'll have that on YouTube for you all to refer back to. Also, I dropped in the chat one more time the link to Gayatri's article that she's referring to that she had on LinkedIn. And it's a most recent mention in the chat. So you guys can go ahead and take a look at that. We have a couple more minutes left. David, I don't know if you have any business to wrap up here at the end or if we want to take another question.
Yeah, just quickly, a big thank you to all of you in the network for all the good work that you did this year. This is our final meeting of the year. We'll be back in January. We have a couple more newsletters coming at you, one this week and one next week, and then we're going to take a couple weeks off to let you enjoy the holidays. But a lot of thanks. And we'll have some news, I think, fairly quickly about WisACT and what this is all going to look like going forward. Scott, do you want to add anything?
I just wanted to thank GMMC, Lacey, and the team in Gayatri. It's particularly for those of us that are political junkies. It was why were things different and what are the trends? And this was excellent. So thank you very much. And thank you, members, for all the work you've done. We truly have made a difference in Wisconsin this year, and hopefully we can continue to do so. With that, I think we have concluded, unless there are any one final question, if you've got time for one more.
Sure.
If not,
Hold on, I've got one or two in here that I can find for you. Oh, I know one. There was a bit of a chat going in a bit about TikTok and the kind of countdown to its possible demise. I was wondering if you had any opinions on that you'd like to share.
Um, I think I will share this perspective on it. It's less a professional opinion and more of a personal one. As the mother of 4 children, ranging in age from 16 to 27, I think if TikTok were to go away, there would be a mutiny in my household and my senses amongst all of their friends. So, rulings notwithstanding, I don't see this actually going away.
Absolutely agree. All right, well, we're at 1:59 East Coast time. I know we are talking to Wisconsin here, but thank you guys so much for having Gayatri here. We are so lucky to have her brain. GMMB is always here to help and answer any questions. If you guys have additional questions from what she shared, we are absolutely happy to do so. You've got David and Scott who can bring us in if you need something from us. Please let us know. And again, I will stay here in the chat if there's any last minute questions. If anyone needs an email or anything, email address or anything from anyone, I'll stay here for a little bit longer. But other than that, thank you all and have a happy holiday.
good
Thanks.
holidays, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone. Have great holidays.
Have a nice holiday.